It wasn't an old umbrella, not quite. The navy fabric still held a sheen, faint like moonlight on a still lake. Its wooden handle, though worn smooth by time, had not splintered. It leaned against the stone wall just outside the station, as if someone had left it for a moment and forgot to return. But what made it remarkable, what drew hesitant glances from passers-by, was the water. Droplets clung to its ribs, a tiny pool gathered at its tip, and beneath it, on the dry pavement baked by midday sun, was a spreading ring of dampness, dark and persistent. It had not rained in days. The sky was bare, pale and wide like stretched canvas. Even the wind had gone silent, unwilling to disturb the unnatural presence of something that wept without cause. Yet the umbrella continued to drip, rhythmically, as though it held within it a storm that the world had long forgotten. Those who walked past gave it space, the kind of space usually reserved for small griefs left unattended in public. They didn't know what it meant, only that it wasn't right. A child once reached out to touch it. Her fingers, curious and soft, hovered above the canopy. Before they could land, her mother tugged her away, a silent gesture sharp with urgency. The girl turned to look back, not with fear, but with the solemn wonder children have for things adults no longer explain. She would dream of that umbrella for weeks afterward, though she'd never understand why it made her feel so strangely sad. Some said it had always been there, that the umbrella predated the renovation of the station, the cobbled path, even the clock that no longer ticked. Others believed someone came to place it there every morning, part of a ritual they dared not speak aloud. But no one ever saw who it belonged to. No hand ever claimed it. No one ever dared take it. People began to use it as a landmark. "I'll meet you by the wet umbrella," they would say, as casually as they might say, "by the statue," or "under the clock." It became part of the town's furniture, a strangeness folded into routine, a mystery that no longer asked to be solved. Over time, they stopped questioning it, but they never touched it. And even after a new layer of paint covered the station walls, the damp trail remained beneath it, immune to sun, untouched by reason. There was something sorrowful in its presence, as though it was not merely wet, but grieving. And the water that dripped from its edge wasn't rain at all, but memory. A memory still clinging to form, still refusing to dry. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, when the trains were delayed and the platform emptied of chatter, the umbrella seemed to breathe. Not visibly, not in any way that could be captured or proved, but the air around it shifted, subtly, like the hush before a confession, or the hush after one. The shadows beneath it thickened, not in darkness but in weight, as though they carried something that words could not. And in that silence the sound of the drops became clearer, more deliberate, almost like footsteps turning away. A maintenance worker once tried to move it. He was new, had transferred from another town, and hadn't yet learned the local unspoken rules. He spotted the umbrella on his morning round and bent down, gloved hands reaching for the wooden handle. The moment his fingers wrapped around it, a cold traveled up his spine, not sharp, but paralyzing, like the weight of someone else's sorrow settling into his bones. He let go immediately, didn't speak of it again, didn't try again. From that day on, he simply swept around it, left the puddle untouched, the droplets uninterrupted. When questioned about it by a fellow worker, he just shook his head. "It's not ours to clean," he said. And somehow, that was enough. A woman once sat beside it for hours. She didn't speak, didn't move much. Her gaze was steady, fixed not on the umbrella but somewhere just past it, like she was trying to remember something that never quite happened. When dusk came, she stood, wiped her hands against her coat, and left, without a word. The bench she had used remained slightly damp for days, even though the weather remained dry. The town priest walked by one evening and paused. He wasn't superstitious, not outwardly, but he crossed himself, gently, thoughtfully, before moving on. It was not a gesture of fear, but one of acknowledgement, as though he recognized grief when he saw it, even if he did not know its name. And so, the umbrella stayed. Seasons changed, commuters came and went, announcements echoed and faded, but it remained, always wet, always alone, always quiet. There was a rumor, soft as dust on library shelves, that the umbrella once belonged to someone who never boarded their train. The story shifted with each telling: a soldier, a widow, a young man with trembling hands, but always the same ending. A final glance at the schedule board, a sigh, a turning back, and a forgotten umbrella left standing in place. Whether it was regret, indecision, or fate that anchored them, no one agreed. But somehow, that narrative settled into the bones of the town like fog into cobblestones. It was said that if you stood near the umbrella long enough, memories would surface. Not your own, but someone else's. A voice in your head, unfamiliar yet strangely dear. A scent you hadn't smelled since childhood but couldn't name. A pressure in your chest like a goodbye never spoken, or perhaps one that never should have been. Some dismissed it as imagination. Others avoided it entirely, just in case it wasn't. One man, passing by on his way to the early shift, paused once too long. He later told his wife he had felt someone take his hand. No one was there, of course. The platform was empty, but the warmth lingered. Not alarming, just human. For the rest of that week, he found himself humming songs he didn't remember learning. He stopped walking past the station entirely, took a different route, just in case. Children dared each other to run up and touch it. Most never made it. Those who did ran back wide-eyed, unable to explain what they felt. Only that it wasn't cold, like water should be. It was warmer than it had any right to be, like tears from a face that had seen too much sun. Sometimes birds perched on its curved handle, never for long. They fluttered away quickly, as though scolded by something unseen. Animals, too, gave it a curious birth. Stray cats avoided the bench beside it. Dogs slowed as they approached, tails low, eyes uncertain. One even whimpered, backing away with quiet apology, as if interrupting something sacred. And still it dripped, drop by drop, a steady rhythm outside of time, a soft insistence that some part of the past had refused to be buried, and perhaps, just perhaps, was waiting, not for resolution, but for recognition. There were those who tried to take photographs of it, tourists mostly, or the occasional urban explorer hoping to capture the uncanny. They always left with blurred images. Sometimes the photo would show the umbrella, but bone dry. Sometimes it wasn't there at all. A few brave ones came with expensive cameras, stood at careful angles, adjusted lenses, and waited. Yet the images never matched what they saw. One woman claimed her photo showed not the umbrella, but a pair of worn shoes resting against the wall, soles turned outward as if their owner had vanished mid-stride. She deleted it quickly. The townspeople no longer explained. When asked, they'd shrug politely and say, "It's always been there," as if that were reason enough, as if permanence excused everything strange. Some even began to fold the umbrella into local lore, not history, but something softer. A myth too recent to be sacred, too consistent to ignore. They whispered it, guarded the memory of someone who waited too long, or perhaps someone who was never meant to leave. One poet, never published, wrote about it in a journal that was never shared. He likened it to the soul of a promise made in the rain. He died before anyone found his words. His nephew, clearing out the attic, stumbled across the poem and read it aloud once, not understanding, not needing to, before quietly tucking it back between old newspapers. He too started using a different station, without knowing why. The bench beside the umbrella aged faster than the others. The wood darkened, warped in places, even when the sun was high and the air dry. Leaves clung to its slats longer than anywhere else, refusing to be swept away. A small green vine had begun to curl at its leg, tender and uninvited, reaching upward in slow devotion. And yet, no one ever tried to remove the umbrella. Not seriously. Not anymore. It had earned its place. Whatever grief it carried, it did so quietly, and the town respected that silence. One autumn evening, long after the last train had passed and the lights along the platform dimmed to their night-setting glow, a figure approached. He was older, not quite elderly, with a gait that betrayed years once hurried and now reluctant. He wore a coat too thin for the wind, and carried nothing but a folded paper in his hand, yellowed and creased, like it had lived in a wallet for a long, long time. He stopped before the umbrella, not startled by it, not hesitant either, just still, as though the thing before him had once been familiar, like a coat he'd forgotten he owned, or a voice he hadn't heard since youth. The folded paper trembled in his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence matched the umbrella's, and for a brief moment, the drops slowed, not stopping, but gentling, like breath meeting breath. He knelt, not because he was tired, but because reverence sometimes has no better posture. He placed the folded paper beneath the umbrella, carefully, as though giving it permission to remain, and then he stood. The wind caught his coat, but he didn't pull it close. He walked away slowly and never turned back. In the days that followed, the umbrella remained, but something had shifted. The air around it grew quieter still. Fewer drops fell. The bench beside it dried, little by little. Leaves no longer clung so stubbornly. The vine receded, as if whatever needed to be said had been heard, or whatever needed to stay had finally been let go. Someone noticed the paper once, now soggy and barely legible, just a few lines in fading ink. I waited. I always did. Forgive the rain. It wasn't mine. Weeks passed. The umbrella still stood, still damp, but different now. The weight it carried seemed lighter, like a book closed after the final page. Not forgotten, but finished. Children no longer dared each other to touch it. They simply walked past, offering it the casual kindness reserved for things that had endured. The pigeons returned to the bench. A woman sat with her newspaper and a coffee, unaware that she had once been wary of that spot. One morning it was gone. No one saw who took it. No footprints, no note, no puddle. Just an empty wall, clean and dry, and a bench with a single leaf resting where the handle used to lean. The townspeople didn't panic. They didn't ask questions. They simply looked once, softly, and nodded. Not in understanding, but in acceptance. Some say it left because it was time. Others think it found the one it was waiting for, or perhaps it simply stopped needing to be remembered, that its sorrow had faded and the rain within it had finally run dry. But now and then, when the sun is high and the air dry, someone might feel a drop land on their sleeve, clear, cool, with no cloud in sight, and though they may look up, puzzled, they'll find nothing there, just the sky, and perhaps, for a moment, the feeling that something once missed has finally passed through them. And in that fleeting trace of moisture, like the echo of grief that no longer hurts, the umbrella lingers, not in form, but in feeling. The absence of the umbrella was not loud. It didn't cause a stir, didn't make the front page of the town paper, didn't prompt whispers the way its presence once had. Its leaving was more like the cooling of a room after someone walks out quietly. You don't notice the moment it happens, but you feel the shift. People still glanced toward the wall out of habit. They still measured time by it, in a way. There was the era when the umbrella stood, and now, the quiet after. Some tried to remember the first time they had seen it, but the beginning had blurred over the years, as if the umbrella had always existed just slightly before memory, just barely outside of time. Without it, the platform looked cleaner, more orderly, but also less real, like a photograph where something important has been cropped out. A station worker placed a potted plant where it used to stand, a modest gesture, perhaps hoping to honor the strangeness that had lived there. But the plant withered within a week, leaves curling inward like secrets retreating. It was quietly removed one early morning, and no one spoke of it again. In its place, emptiness was allowed to remain, and that emptiness became, in time, another kind of presence, not haunted, not heavy, but sacred in its own quiet way. Travelers still paused, not sure why. Some stood longer than needed, bags at their feet, eyes unfocused. A few even forgot to board their train. They would apologize to the station master, flustered, unable to explain what had distracted them. But he never asked. He only nodded and rescheduled their tickets without charge. Children, now older, began to draw the umbrella from memory. in chalk on sidewalks, in corners of notebooks during slow afternoons at school. Some drawings included the puddle, others the bench. A few added names they couldn't trace back to anyone in town. One child wrote beneath their sketch, "It waited. I saw it." No teacher knew what the child meant, but the drawing was kept, pinned on a corkboard longer than the others, as if it carried something weightier than its colors. On certain days, when the wind turned just enough to lift the edges of coats and carry forgotten perfumes through the air, people swore they could still hear the dripping. Not loud, not persistent, just a single drop now and then, like the punctuation of a thought left unfinished. They would look up, expecting rain, but the sky remained unbroken. Some rubbed their forearms absent-mindedly, brushing away what wasn't there. Others simply stood still, eyes soft, as if they were on the verge of remembering something not quite theirs, but close. In a quiet corner of the town's library, tucked between local history and forgotten fiction, there was a folder that no one checked out but everyone seemed to know about. It contained photographs of the platform, most of them ordinary, except for the years when the umbrella stood. In those, the image always came out hazy, not blurred by motion, but by something softer, like breath on glass. Even the best cameras captured it as if seen through memory, not through a lens. One photo, taken by accident by a student practicing depth of field, showed not only the umbrella but a second shadow next to it, faint, tall, and facing away. She had deleted the file, not out of fear, but out of an instinct she couldn't name. The librarians never removed the folder, never reshelved it elsewhere. It remained exactly where it was, as if the building had agreed to hold space for something that belonged neither in fiction nor fact. Occasionally, someone would open it, glance through its contents, and close it again slowly. None of the images changed, but the feeling they left behind always did. Sometimes wistful, sometimes hollow, sometimes so tender it hurt. Elsewhere, a local musician wrote a song without lyrics. He said it came to him fully formed one morning, like something passed through him rather than composed. He played it once at a gathering in the square, a soft, repetitive melody that never quite resolved. The audience listened in silence. No applause, no chatter. When the song ended, a woman near the back stood still for several seconds before quietly leaving. She had been holding her breath, though she didn't know why. At the station, the bench remained, and though new coats of paint were applied, they never seemed to last. The wood absorbed them, dulled them. Commuters sat and waited like always, but the ones who sat too long often left looking slightly altered. Not shaken, but changed in a way they couldn't quite explain. As if something in them had been softened, as if they'd been reminded of a sorrow they didn't remember having. And in that corner of the platform, beneath the wall where the umbrella once leaned, moisture sometimes returned. A faint sheen, a thin line that shimmered in morning light and vanished by noon. No one spoke of it aloud, but those who noticed it paused, not to analyze, not to wonder, but simply to acknowledge. And then, quietly, they moved on, a little slower than before. There was an old woman who came to the station every Sunday, even though she hadn't taken a train in years. She carried a woven bag that sagged with age and held, among other things, a small notebook bound with twine. She always chose the same bench, the one beside where the umbrella had once stood, and sat for exactly 30 minutes, rain or shine. She never wrote in the notebook. She simply held it in her lap, one hand resting gently on the cover, as if listening for something. No one disturbed her. Children didn't run past her. Even pigeons kept a respectful distance, pecking at crumbs in other corners of the platform. Some said she had known the person who left the umbrella. Others believed she was the one who left it. But she never confirmed anything. Her silence was not evasive. It was complete, like a closed door in a room no longer furnished. She smiled at those who greeted her, but her eyes were always elsewhere, searching for something that perhaps never returned. One morning she didn't come. Another week passed. And then another. Eventually, the bench she favored was taken by others. But those who sat there always felt a strange reluctance to stay long. Not discomfort, more like the feeling of stepping into someone else's unfinished story. One janitor, who worked the early shift, claimed he saw her once after she stopped coming. It was near dawn, mist clinging low to the ground, and he was sweeping the edge of the platform. She stood at the far end, near the track that hadn't been used in decades. Her posture was the same, her hand still holding that familiar notebook. He didn't call out. He simply blinked, and when he looked again, she was gone. He never mentioned it again, but he cleaned around the bench more carefully after that, as if honoring a space not marked by signs but by memory. There was a man who came years later, a stranger to the town, carrying an umbrella wrapped in cloth. He sat briefly on the same bench, unwrapped the item, and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't the same umbrella, not exactly. The color was different. The handle was newer. But he looked at it with the kind of recognition that goes deeper than sight. He left it behind, leaned gently against the wall, as though placing something back where it had always belonged. But by morning, it was gone again, and the wall remained dry. Some things cannot be regifted to the world once they've been released. Some objects carry purpose only once. After that, they become echoes, not empty, but spent. As the years passed, the story of the umbrella faded from conversation, but not from presence. It became one of those things that children absorbed without being told, like the smell of old paper in the library, or the way the clock tower chimed 2 minutes late, but no one ever fixed it. The younger generation knew of the umbrella without knowing how they knew, as if the memory had slipped into the dust of the town itself, carried not by storytelling but by air and architecture. Even those who had never seen it firsthand recognized it in dreams. It appeared not as a mystery, but as a comfort, a shape that made sense in the language of rain. One child, during a quiet afternoon art class, drew the umbrella not on the platform, but in the middle of a living room. It stood open beside a chair, casting a long shadow across the carpet. When asked about the picture, the child only shrugged and said, "It was raining inside." The teacher, unsettled but unsure why, pinned the drawing beside the window and moved on. Later that month, a second child drew the same thing, unprompted. This time, the umbrella was closed, leaning against a bookshelf dripping onto a stack of unopened letters. No one spoke of it publicly, but there was a growing sense that the umbrella had not disappeared, only shifted, as if it no longer needed to stay in one place to be found. People began to see signs of it in small, inexplicable wet patches, on doorsteps after clear nights, on the pages of books left open too long, on windows that fogged only in the shape of a curved handle. These moments didn't frighten anyone. If anything, they brought a kind of stillness, as if something long unsettled had passed by to say, "I remember." And in remembering, it left a little trace of peace. One elderly couple, unaware of the legend but sensitive in that quiet way long love teaches, noticed their umbrella had begun to behave oddly. It was a gift from years ago, left mostly unused in the back corner of their hallway. But lately they found it open some mornings, standing on its own beside the door. It was always slightly damp, though it hadn't been out. They laughed at first. An old house, drafty and creaking, could play small tricks. But after the third morning, the husband closed it carefully and asked, half joking, if it had somewhere to go. That night, he dreamed of a station platform he didn't recognize, a bench he'd never sat on, and the sound of dripping water that came from nowhere. In the dream, he wasn't lost, just late. He woke up before dawn, holding his wife's hand, and whispered, "I think we're still waiting." She didn't ask for what. Some questions don't need answers to be shared. That morning, the umbrella was dry for the first time in weeks. Others began to report similar things. Umbrellas long forgotten began to move. Some fell from hooks at odd times. One woman found hers open in the garden, shielding a single dry patch of earth where no rain had fallen. She stood for a long time staring at it, sensing not fear, but permission, as though she could grieve something quietly there, without explanation. And still, no one mentioned the umbrella at the station directly. It was not denial. It was reverence. Like a song that once meant everything but whose lyrics no longer needed to be sung aloud. It had done what it came to do. and the world, in small, unseen corners, was gentler for it. The platform now belongs to newer generations. The paint is refreshed, the bench is replaced. A small kiosk stands where the waiting area used to be, offering coffee and hand pies and postcards with cheerful slogans. The world has grown louder, quicker. Trains arrive more efficiently now. Announcements are digital, and no one waits without a phone in hand. And yet, the wall where the umbrella once leaned remains untouched, not by rule, but by instinct. No advertisements are placed there, no signs. The bricks are older than the rest, and though no one speaks of it, no one defaces them. Some evenings, when the station quiets again and the last train is gone, the night returns something familiar. Not a figure, not a shadow, just a sense, like the faint memory of being sheltered, of standing beneath something that did not keep you dry but kept you company. In that space, people sometimes pause without meaning to, their bodies remembering what their minds have forgotten. And if they listen closely, very closely, they might hear it again. Not the dripping, but the echo of a pause. The weight of something waiting, not for a person, not even for an ending, but for the world to notice that waiting itself is a kind of presence, a quiet one, a sacred one, like the umbrella that never dried. Even now, some umbrellas refuse to stay dry when brought to that station. Just a few drops, just enough to be noticed, just enough to be remembered. Long before the umbrella appeared, the station had been merely a waypoint, a place for departures and arrivals, for clocks and timetables, for footsteps that echoed briefly before fading into elsewhere. It had no stories then, only schedules. No one lingered. No one looked twice at the stone wall where it would someday stand. That corner, unremarkable and often overlooked, had once been a place of shadows, where cigarette smoke curled during brief goodbyes, where stray cats curled between journeys, and where the forgotten collected like dust. It was just another edge of a town too small to matter on maps. But something changed the moment the umbrella arrived. Not instantly, not loudly, but definitively, as though space itself had decided to remember something. There are those who believe that certain objects hold emotion longer than the people who touch them, that a coat can carry grief, a ring can echo betrayal, a letter can hum with the heat of unsent love. The umbrella, by those standards, had become a reservoir, not just of water, but of intention, of pause, of promises that had no clear shape but had weight nonetheless. And because no one claimed it, because no one defined it, it remained open to interpretation. In that openness, it gathered meaning the way it gathered drops, slowly, consistently, until it dripped with it. Even those who dismissed the legend as folklore found themselves unconsciously drawn to the place where it had once stood. The new station map, modern and backlit, had a tiny blemish on that exact spot, a glitch in the printing that no one bothered to fix. Some thought it looked like a droplet, others a tear. A few didn't see it at all, but the ones who did noticed it every time. They would trace it with their fingers briefly before moving on, as if reminding themselves that not everything had to be clear to be felt. A local painter who had never spoken of the umbrella publicly began to include it in the background of his landscapes. Sometimes it stood alone in a field of wheat, sometimes beside a solitary gravestone, sometimes half open in a forest clearing. He never explained why. When asked, he only said, "It balances the sky." The gallery owner smiled and nodded, not understanding but not needing to. The paintings sold slowly, but those who bought them never resold. They hung them in quiet corners of their homes, near doorways or reading chairs, places where people passed through, never sat long but always felt something ease inside them. Even in absence, the umbrella had found ways to remain, not out of insistence, but out of resonance. It had touched something so human, the ache of waiting, the dignity of holding space, the beauty of not being understood, that it no longer needed to exist to be believed. There was a quiet theory, passed between those who noticed such things, that the umbrella had never truly belonged to a person, but rather to a moment. That it had arrived not with someone, but for something. The way certain silences fall just before a revelation, or the way light catches on dust right before a memory surfaces. According to this idea, the umbrella didn't appear as an object left behind, but as a presence summoned, the physical shape of something the world wasn't ready to name. And when that moment passed, when it had done its invisible work, it simply ceased to need form. This theory, of course, couldn't be proven, but those who believed it never tried to convince anyone. They were content to sit with the idea the way one sits with an old friend, not dissecting it, but respecting it. They walked past the platform differently, slower, softer, and sometimes they found themselves looking at the sky more often, not to predict the weather, but to measure the weight of air. They noticed how some clouds seemed to pause over the station, how some breezes curved just slightly as if avoiding a certain corner. These were small things, easily dismissed. But once noticed, they couldn't be unseen. A teacher at the local school began leaving a chair empty in her classroom, not for discipline, not for utility, just there. She didn't explain it to the students, only said, "Sometimes space needs to be held." The children accepted it, as they often do, without demanding logic. And over time, some began to place small objects on the chair, a pebble, a folded paper, a broken crayon. Not gifts, not offerings, just acknowledgments. The chair never overflowed. The items came and went, but the space remained. At a bakery near the station, condensation began appearing on the same window each morning, always a single streak, descending slowly like a tear. The baker tried wiping it, adjusting the humidity, even replacing the pane. But it returned, always in the same place. She stopped fighting it. Eventually, she placed a small vase beneath the spot, changed the flower weekly, and never explained why. Customers noticed, of course, but no one asked. Instead, they began speaking in softer tones while ordering. Some even lingered longer near the window, their fingers unconsciously tracing the glass. The umbrella, it seemed, had become something more than remembered. It had become a pattern, not of behavior, but of being. A ripple in the way the town breathed, a softness in the edge of ordinary things. And in that subtle influence, it continued its quiet work, shaping how people waited, how they listened, how they let go. In one of the older parts of town, where the streets narrowed and the houses leaned slightly toward each other like confidants sharing old secrets, there was a cobbler's shop that hadn't changed in decades. The sign was faded, the bell above the door rusted but loyal, and the windows dusted with the kind of grime that only time applies gently. The cobbler, a man of few words and slower movements, rarely took new customers. Most who entered were returning faces, the kind who remembered when soles were stitched by hand and when silence was part of the transaction. On a particularly still afternoon, a woman came in with a pair of shoes. They were ordinary enough, soft leather, scuffed at the toes, soles beginning to peel. But when she handed them over, the cobbler paused, not because of their condition, but because of the water. The shoes were damp, not soaked, not muddy, just faintly wet, like they had been worn through mist that hadn't touched the rest of the world. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. But something passed between them. A recognition, quiet and wordless. Like the moment when two strangers realize they've both visited the same dream. He took the shoes, placed them gently on the workbench, and didn't begin work immediately. Instead, he sat for a while, letting the moisture breathe out of them. And as he waited, he noticed a pattern in the dampness, a curved line near the heel, faint but deliberate, like the arc of something once sheltering. He traced it with his thumb, then let it be. When the repairs were done, he placed a folded cloth inside each shoe, not for dryness, but for memory. The woman returned the next day, paid in exact change, and smiled in that way people do when they're not sure if they've lost something or found it. She didn't stay. But after she left, the cobbler looked at the space where she had stood and saw, for a brief second, the faintest imprint of an umbrella handle on the wooden floor, as if it had leaned there while she spoke, silent and unnoticed. By the time he blinked, it had vanished. Later that evening, he closed the shop early. Not out of weariness, but out of fullness. The kind that arrives not from having completed a task, but from having witnessed something that did not need to be named. He locked the door, turned off the lights, and stood at the threshold for a while. The sky was clear, the air dry, but still, he reached into the stand by the door and pulled out his old umbrella, unused for years, fraying at the edges, and carried it open all the way home. In the quiet hours just before dawn, when the world is still more idea than reality, the town took on a different shape. Streets felt longer, shadows gentler, and even the birds hesitated before beginning their morning declarations. It was in those hours that the umbrella was sometimes felt most clearly, not as a memory, but as an atmosphere. The platform, though empty, would hum faintly with the kind of presence that didn't require form. The lamplight above the old bench would flicker, not from wiring issues, but as though it was acknowledging something, or someone, unseen. The station janitor, now older, had taken to arriving a bit earlier than required. Not to clean, but to sit. He brought a small thermos of tea wrapped in a cloth and sipped slowly while watching the stillness unfold. He never looked at the wall directly, but his gaze hovered nearby, respectful and unintrusive. There was no sadness in his face, only patience. The kind of patience one sees in those who understand that some things take longer to leave, and some never do, because they were never meant to. One morning, as he poured the last of his tea, he noticed a single feather resting on the bench, pale gray, curled slightly at the tip, and damp. Not soaked, just moistened enough to glisten in the early light. He didn't pick it up. He didn't wipe it away. He simply placed his empty cup beside it, folded the cloth slowly, and nodded once, to the bench, to the feather, to the invisible thread that seemed to tie the moment together. When he returned the next day, both feather and cup were gone, and yet the bench felt fuller somehow, as if something had been answered. The janitor didn't change his routine. He kept coming early, but now he began humming softly, a tune without origin, repeating the same 3 notes, always ending on a breath. He said nothing of it to his co-workers. They never asked. The quiet had settled in like furniture, part of the place, part of the story. There was a rainy season one year that lasted longer than usual. Not violent storms or flooded roads, just a long, steady rain that blurred the edges of every afternoon and softened the mornings into mist. The town accepted it without resistance. Umbrellas bloomed like petals along sidewalks. Boots left muddy trails into shops. Conversations grew slower, deeper, and for some reason, no one complained. People said it felt familiar, like a long-delayed letter finally arriving, as though something forgotten had returned to finish a sentence. During that season, a peculiar pattern emerged. Several umbrellas in town, different colors, brands, sizes, began to drip even after being left open indoors. Residents would set them by the door, wipe them dry, and hours later find small puddles beneath them. The floors were not wet from outside. The roofs did not leak. And yet, the water kept appearing, clear, scentless, slow. It unnerved some, amused others. A few began placing bowls beneath the handles, just in case. Strangely, the bowls never filled. Only 1 or 2 drops would gather, then stop. It was as if the umbrellas wept, not from sadness, but from relief. An elderly woman, living alone on the outskirts of town, reported hearing the sound of dripping in her hallway every evening at the same time. When she investigated, there was no leak, no open window, no umbrella, just the sound, gentle, consistent, and oddly comforting. She began placing a chair beneath the sound, sitting there with a blanket over her knees and a cup of warm milk. "It's the closest I've felt to company in years," she once said to a neighbor. She passed away peacefully that spring. The new tenant who moved in later never heard the sound again. And still, the rain continued. Not heavy, not harsh, but meaningful, the way some silences are more profound than words. People began walking more slowly under it. Children stopped trying to avoid puddles. The town, it seemed, had remembered how to let something linger. And in that remembering, the umbrella's absence felt less like loss and more like completion. When the rain finally ceased and the skies cleared, the town did not return to what it had been. Something had shifted. People noticed the light more, the way it filtered through leaves, caught in window panes, kissed the cobblestones dry. The station remained the same in structure, but it breathed differently. Travelers paused longer before boarding. Some turned to look at the wall instinctively, as if expecting to see something. They never did. But the act of looking itself seemed to be enough. A new mural was proposed for the platform, bright, abstract shapes, modern and vibrant. But when the proposal was brought to the council, there was hesitation. Not resistance exactly, but unease. Someone quietly asked if the mural would cover the far wall, the one beside the bench. When the artist said yes, the room fell quiet. After a moment, someone else suggested adjusting the layout, keeping that wall bare. The motion passed without further discussion. The mural was painted, but the space where the umbrella once stood remained untouched. It was never addressed in speeches or press releases, just respected. Years later, visitors would ask why that one section of wall had been left blank. Tour guides would smile and say, tradition or a design choice, depending on the tone of the question. But none would explain the real reason, because there wasn't just one. It wasn't about fear or reverence anymore. It was about rhythm, about giving space to something that had once held meaning and might one day again. A pause in the architecture, a breath made visible. And if, on a rare morning, a single droplet was found glistening on that bench, despite clear skies and dry air, no one called it strange. They simply stepped around it quietly, as though letting something finish its sentence, before it disappeared once more. In time, the umbrella became to the town what a phantom limb is to the body, no longer visible, no longer touchable, but still undeniably present, like a missing key you continue reaching for, or a familiar song that plays in your head even when the radio is off. Its shape lingered in the mind, not as an object, but as a gesture, a reaching, a holding, a sheltering that existed beyond physical form. It wasn't about rain anymore, or even waiting. It was about the space that is created when something remains unseen but still deeply felt. The wall beside the bench grew more worn with each passing season, not in a way that demanded repair, but in the way old books show their worth. Smoothed edges, softened corners, ink slightly faded where fingertips once paused too long. No one dared clean it thoroughly. A new employee once attempted to scrub the lower bricks, hoping to impress. But midway through, the rag grew heavy in her hand, and the scent of water filled her nose. Not fresh rain, but something older, deeper, like the inside of a forgotten well. She stepped back, unsure, and never touched that wall again. No one told her to stop, but no one asked her to continue either. At a cafe near the edge of town, a regular patron began folding napkins into the shape of umbrellas. Not artfully, not even deliberately, just little twists and bends while waiting for coffee, absent-minded as someone might doodle in the margins of thought. The pile would build up slowly, and then he'd throw them away before leaving. One day the barista, curious, saved one. She placed it beside the cash register, where it stood for weeks, flimsy, crooked, but strangely dignified. Customers asked about it. She shrugged. Someone left it, she said, though she wasn't sure why she kept it. Across town, a florist started selling arrangements shaped loosely like an open canopy, white blooms curving outward, stems bunched tightly in the center like a handle. She didn't name them after the umbrella, but people who bought them said they felt something soothing about the design, like being held without being touched. One woman bought a bouquet for her mother's grave and returned a week later to say the flowers hadn't wilted, even in the rain. The florist said nothing. Just wrapped another one, a little tighter this time. The presence of the umbrella had become like a low note in a piece of music. Not the melody, not even something you could hum, but the thing that made everything else sound fuller. It wasn't missed because it hadn't truly gone. It had woven itself into the quiet gestures of everyday life, like steam curling from a teacup, or the creak of a chair that remembers your weight even after you've stood. On a narrow street just beyond the edge of town, where cobblestones had begun to sink slightly into the soft earth and the houses leaned with age rather than design, there stood a clock repair shop that no longer took appointments. Its sign was faded, almost invisible unless the afternoon sun struck it at a precise angle, and its windows were thick with dust, the kind that softened light and held time still. The man who owned it, or perhaps merely kept it, was rarely seen. But locals knew he was there. Lights glowed faintly behind curtains some evenings. The scent of metal polish occasionally drifted through the doorframe, and once in a while, a newly ticking clock appeared in someone's home, repaired without request, with no note and no charge. It was said the man had once worked in the station itself, long before the umbrella had arrived. Back then, he had kept the wall clocks aligned with the train schedule, winding them by hand, listening to their rhythms as if they were breathing. He was the sort who understood time not as measurement, but as texture, how it pulled differently in silence than in conversation, how it expanded in waiting rooms and collapsed in goodbyes. When he left the station, no one knew why. But not long after, the umbrella appeared, and though no one made the connection aloud, some felt the timing was not accidental. Inside his shop, the walls were lined with clocks of every kind, pendulums, pocket watches, cuckoos, even small, quiet sand timers placed like offerings on narrow shelves. None of them matched in time. Some were minutes ahead, others hours behind. A few didn't move at all, and yet the man never adjusted them. "They're not wrong," he had once said to a visitor who commented on the inconsistency. "They're just remembering different moments." One night, after weeks of rain and days of quiet sun, the man opened the door of his shop and placed a single umbrella outside. It was old, perhaps older than the town itself, with a wooden handle smoothed by years and a canopy darkened by weather. But it was dry, impossibly dry, the kind of dryness that seemed deliberate, not natural. He didn't attach a note. He didn't linger. He simply set it down and returned inside. By morning, it was gone. Those who passed by later said they didn't see anyone take it, but the space it had occupied seemed marked, not by moisture or weight, but by memory, as though the act of placing it there had drawn something closer, like gravity. That evening, the clocks in his shop all stopped for 1 minute, then resumed. No one noticed except the man, and when they began again, he smiled, not in amusement, but in agreement, as if something unspoken had finally aligned, if only for a moment. There was an inn at the edge of the town, where travelers rarely stayed for more than a night. It wasn't unfriendly. The rooms were clean, the sheets crisp, the breakfast served with quiet care. But it had the air of a place that preferred those passing through, rather than those settling in. The woman who ran it had inherited it from her aunt, who had once been known for keeping a book of every guest who ever stayed. Not just names and dates, but details, what kind of tea they preferred, whether they read before bed, if they looked out the window first thing in the morning or last before sleep. The book was never shown, only spoken of, and after her aunt passed, no one could find it. The niece searched the drawers, the attic, the space beneath floorboards. Nothing. Still, she felt the record lingered in the building itself. Guests often remarked that the rooms felt familiar, even if they had never been before, that the drawers already contained what they had forgotten to pack, that the view from the window seemed to match a memory they couldn't quite place. The woman never dismissed these comments. She simply nodded and asked if they would like more sugar in their tea. One autumn evening, a quiet man arrived with no reservation. He carried no luggage, just a walking stick and an umbrella bound with a frayed ribbon. The woman gave him the room at the end of the hall, the one with the corner window, where the wind whispered most clearly through the cracks. He stayed only one night, spoke little, but left behind the umbrella leaning in the corner, still faintly damp, though no rain had fallen. When she found it, she didn't move it, didn't dry it. She simply let it stand there, as though it had chosen the room itself. Over the following weeks, something shifted in that space. Guests placed their reported unusually vivid dreams. Not nightmares, not quite memories, but moments heavy with recognition. One man woke with tears on his face and no idea why. A woman reported dreaming of a platform she had never seen, and a feeling of waiting that filled her chest like music. No one asked to change rooms. They simply stayed, then left quietly, as if having received something they hadn't known they were missing. The woman never advertised the room, never mentioned the umbrella. But every time she entered to prepare it for the next guest, she paused by the corner, laid a fresh towel nearby, and opened the window just slightly, enough to let in the scent of rain, even on dry days. And in the space between checkout and arrival, the room breathed, slowly, like something had settled there, not to haunt, but to hold. The town's post office, though modest in size, bore the architecture of an era when permanence mattered. Stone columns, brass fixtures dulled by decades of touch, and wooden counters worn smooth by the weight of elbows and folded letters. It was a place where things paused before becoming part of someone else's story. The clerk who had worked there the longest was a man who believed in the sacredness of envelopes. He sorted them gently, as if they carried not paper, but breath. He never pried, but he noticed. The handwriting, the stamps, the weight of sorrow or joy tucked between pages. It all spoke, in quiet tones only he had learned to hear. One letter, some years back, had arrived without an address. No return name, no town, no country, just a drawing on the envelope, hand-sketched in faded ink. It was a picture of an umbrella, not detailed, just a simple arc with a curved handle and a single drop falling from its tip. The clerk, uncertain of protocol, placed it on the shelf marked held items and forgot about it, or thought he had. Because every few months it seemed to shift slightly. Never farther, never closer, just adjusted, as if someone had come in and touched it with purpose, then walked away. During one long winter when snow curled over the gutters and boots lined the office wall like resting birds, the letter vanished. Not misplaced, simply gone. No one had come to claim it. No one had mailed it, but its absence was noted. The clerk, for reasons he couldn't explain, left its space empty on the shelf, even though others needed sorting. That space stayed clear ever since, a quiet gap in the rhythm of routine, like a silence that had earned its place. He still dreams of the envelope sometimes. In the dreams, he's holding it under a wide sky that offers no rain, but feels wet nonetheless. There's no platform, no bench, just the sense of waiting, and the deep certainty that whatever message it held was never meant to be read, only delivered. In the town's greenhouse, where humidity clung to the glass like breath and vines crept with unrushed devotion along beams and sills, something peculiar began to happen with the water. The gardener, a quiet woman with earth-stained hands and a habit of humming in minor keys, noticed that certain plants refused to drink, not out of drought or illness, but selectiveness. Pots beneath the western window remained damp, even when untouched. Ferns near the back wall thrived, though never watered directly. And in the center, where no pipe ran and no misting reached, a puddle remained constant, small, clean, and always centered beneath the hanging ivy. She tested for leaks, replaced trays, measured humidity. Nothing explained it. Eventually, she stopped trying. She simply began placing a small white stone in the puddle's center every morning. Not as a solution, but as a ritual. The stone sank slightly as if acknowledging its role, and by evening the water was always still. One visitor, wandering in with a notebook and the distracted eyes of someone chasing something invisible, paused by the ivy and whispered, "It's the same curve." The gardener didn't ask what he meant. She had heard others say similar things, about arches in the leaves, the sound of dripping where no drop fell, the faint scent of fabric in the soil. She never confirmed or denied. She only kept the puddle clean, the stone placed, and the ivy trimmed just so. And each morning, before unlocking the glass doors, she would touch the fog on the inner pane, tracing a curve like the top of an umbrella with her index finger, not out of belief, not out of superstition, but out of respect, for whatever memory had taken root in the air and chosen to bloom quietly among the green. At the edge of the town, where the fields began to stretch unbroken and the road thinned into a suggestion rather than a promise, There stood a weathered sign marking the boundary, not for travelers, but for the town itself. It had no name carved into it anymore, just the faint impression of letters long since erased by wind and time. People rarely noticed it, but once a year, on the first fog of spring, someone, no one knew who, would hang a ribbon from one of the sign's nails. It was always the same, soft gray, slightly frayed, damp to the touch no matter the weather. It stayed for a week, then vanished. No one claimed the tradition, no one interrupted it, and no one removed the ribbon when it hung. It fluttered gently, not with urgency, but with remembrance, like a hand waving from a distance, not asking to be seen, only not to be forgotten. Some said it marked the path the umbrella had taken when it left. Others believed it was placed for those who never arrived, a way of saying, "You are still part of here," even if no one could name who "you" was. Children learned not to ask too much about it. Adults learned to look once and move on, slightly softer in their step. The field beyond the sign sometimes shimmered in the early light. A haze, they said. Morning dew. But those who walked through it always emerged changed. Not visibly, not with stories. Just quieter. As if they had stood for a moment beneath something sheltering, something that had once offered its shade not to shield, but to hold. And in that holding, even the air had learned to wait. In the attic of a retired schoolhouse, long since converted into a quiet municipal building with more echoes than visitors, there was a storage room that hadn't been opened in years. The key had been misplaced, the handle rusted stiff, and no one had felt the need to force it open. Paperwork had moved elsewhere, and the stories that lingered in that building had grown content with silence. But during a routine inspection prompted by renovations, no one was truly eager to begin. A custodian discovered the door ajar, not forced, not broken, just slightly open, as though it had been waiting without impatience. Inside, the air was still, thick with the scent of wood, dust, and ink that had dried decades ago. Shelves lined the walls, uneven and bowed with the weight of forgotten files. Among them were student notebooks, old curricula, name tags from events no one remembered hosting. But near the far wall, propped against a broken easel, was a closed umbrella, charcoal gray, with a wooden handle carved faintly into the shape of a spiral. It was dry. Or rather, it should have been. The floor beneath it was damp, a perfect circle of moisture darkening the wood, seeping gently outward like a held breath. The custodian didn't touch it. He stood a few feet away, unsure whether the strangeness came from the object itself or the feeling it stirred in his chest. A mixture of longing and recognition that didn't belong to any specific memory. Just the sense that something had been paused there for a long time, waiting to be noticed again. He left the door open when he backed out. He didn't mention the umbrella in the report, but he returned the next day and the day after, just to make sure it was still there. It always was. Word spread slowly. A clerk from downstairs came to see, then the building supervisor, a town historian. None of them touched it. None of them moved it. But each stood in the doorway for a few minutes longer than they intended, as though listening to something beneath the ordinary sounds of a quiet room. Eventually, a chair was placed beside the easel, not by decision, but by natural progression. Visitors began to leave small things on the seat: a pressed flower, a folded map, a child's drawing of rain. No one called it an exhibit. There was no plaque, no explanation. But over time, the room took on a new stillness, not the stillness of abandonment, but of reverence. And the umbrella remained unopened, unmoved, surrounded by a hush that felt like gratitude. It didn't matter whether it was the same umbrella or another. What mattered was that its presence reminded people of something they couldn't quite name, and yet didn't want to forget. Across town, tucked between a tailor's shop and a flower stall that changed owners more often than seasons, there was a narrow alley few people used. It wasn't unpleasant, no foul smells, no graffiti, no litter, but it had the feeling of a space that remembered more than it revealed. The cobblestones were uneven in a way that suggested former paths now buried, and the walls on either side leaned in slightly, as though trying to keep a secret between them. During daylight, it seemed unremarkable. But in early mornings and just after rain, something shifted. The light hit differently. Not brighter, not dimmer, just slower. As if the alley preferred to reveal itself one breath at a time. There were rumors that if you walked down it at the right hour, you might hear a drip, even on the driest day. Not a leak, not a fault in the guttering, but a singular sound, measured, deliberate, familiar. Most people dismissed it, but a few began to detour through the alley, pretending not to hope. They brought with them thoughts they didn't know how to end, apologies unsent, questions unanswered, the weight of waiting with nowhere to place it. And sometimes, when they passed through slowly enough, they emerged lighter, not transformed, not healed, just a little more able to walk into the next thing. One evening, a girl on her way home from the late bus route stopped at the mouth of the alley. She didn't know why. The sun had just set, the air still warm, but she felt drawn. She stood there, listening. No footsteps behind her, no wind, just the low hum of the world settling into dusk. And then, faint, almost mist, a drip. Not near, not far. A sound like a thought you've nearly forgotten brushing the edge of your attention. She didn't enter. She only smiled, a small, private smile, as if the alley had said something meant only for her. She touched the strap of her backpack, a small, nervous gesture, then turned and continued on. But for weeks afterward, she found herself sketching the curve of umbrellas in the margins of her notebooks, not with detail, just shape, just suggestion, always dripping, always closed. And when it rained, she walked slower, no longer ducking under awnings or rushing toward shelter, as if she had already been protected once by something that didn't need to open to cover her. The alley remained, unmarked, unnamed. But those who passed through it on quiet days often left with their shoulders just slightly more relaxed, as though something in the air had leaned gently into them and whispered, "It's all right to keep waiting, even when you forget what for." Near the outskirts of town, where the land flattened into quiet fields and the trees began to space themselves like patient observers, there was a bench facing nothing in particular. It hadn't been placed for scenery. There was no dramatic view, no pond or statue or flowering archway, just grass, sky, and wind. The wood of the bench had silvered over the years, and its bolts loosened just enough to creak gently when someone sat. Most people didn't. It was too far from the center, too exposed, too still. But for a few, it became a place to pause without needing a reason, a space not to reflect or to remember, but simply to be. Those who sat there often brought nothing with them. No books, no phones, no distractions. Some came only once. Others returned without realizing it. A few carved nothing into the wood, left no initials, but placed their hands flat on the seat as though grounding themselves in something just beneath the surface. The wind here behaved differently. It didn't gust or whip. It moved like breath, slow, invisible, but steady. And when it passed over the bench, the air grew cooler, not colder, like a shadow that didn't darken. One morning, after an especially long stretch of dry days, a park worker found a damp spot on the bench's center slat. No rain had fallen. No sprinkler reached that far. There were no footprints, no signs of animals, nothing to explain it. Just a gentle oval, darker than the surrounding wood, soft at the edges as though it had arrived slowly and with care. The worker wiped it away, but the next morning it returned. He stopped trying after that. The mark wasn't always there. Some days the bench was dry, ordinary, but on others, especially when the sky held that particular hush before change, the mark would reappear, always in the same spot, always faint. People began to sit beside it, not on it, as though leaving room. They didn't speak of it to one another, but over time, the bench became known as the place that listens. No one claimed it officially. No plaque appeared. It was never added to town maps or brochures. But still it gathered visitors, especially those who carried something unsaid. A girl once left a folded paper beneath the bench, weighed down by a flat stone. It had no writing, only a small drawing of an umbrella and a heart beside it. When she returned days later, the paper was gone, but the stone remained, and beside it, a feather, pale gray, curved just slightly at the tip. From that day on, she began leaving feathers instead of words. In the town's antique store, a narrow place with too little light and too many clocks ticking out of sync, there was a back shelf where the owner placed items that were not for sale. She never explained this section to customers, never labeled it, never dusted it more than necessary. The objects there were not broken, but they didn't belong on display either. A tarnished bell without a chime, a porcelain doll whose eyes refused to close, a photograph frame with no backing, and a faint, persistent scent of lavender. And recently, something new. A small, tightly wrapped bundle of fabric, shaped unmistakably like a folded umbrella. The cloth was deep blue, frayed slightly along the edge. It bore no tag, no price. It simply appeared one morning, tucked among the others, like a confession. The owner noticed it right away. Not because it stood out, it didn't, but because it seemed to press gently against its surroundings, as if requesting a little more space. She granted it, moved the nearby items a few inches to the left, and placed a linen square beneath the bundle, though she didn't know why. Some customers noticed. A few reached toward it, but always stopped just short, their fingers hovering as if approaching a memory not their own. One woman leaned in and whispered, "I used to have one just like this," then left without buying anything. Another man asked if it had always been there, and when told no, he nodded slowly and said, "Then it finally made it." The bundle never unraveled, never shifted. But once, after a week of rain, the cloth was found to be damp at the corners. The surrounding shelf was dry. The ceiling above it had no leak. And when the owner touched it, just once lightly, a single drop fell to the floor and disappeared before it could spread. She said nothing, but from that day on, she placed a teacup beside it each morning, empty and white. At the end of the day, she would check. And though she never found water inside, the cup always felt heavier. The train station had long since been renovated. New signs, brighter lighting, a digital timetable that blinked politely at those who squinted to read it. The benches were replaced with sleeker models, resistant to rust and emotion. The ticket counter had become a kiosk. And yet, behind the modernity, just beneath the surface of steel and schedule, something older still pulsed. Near where the umbrella had once stood, now tiled and smoothed and glossed into forgetfulness, the air held a memory of weight, not visible, not traceable. But those who lingered near that corner found themselves breathing differently, slower, shallower, as though matching a rhythm that was not their own. Some brushed their sleeves without thinking, checking for rain that never fell. Others stood with their backs to the wall and found themselves glancing down, expecting to see a puddle where their feet were. Once, a child dropped a toy beside the wall and refused to pick it up. He said it was too wet. His mother, confused, reached down and found the floor warm and dry. But she didn't press him. She simply took his hand, left the toy, and walked away a little more gently than before. Station staff no longer commented on the small damp spot that occasionally appeared near the west-facing bench. It never grew, never spread. It came and went without pattern, and was always gone by nightfall. When asked, the janitor shrugged and said, "Some things don't clean off." Travelers who sat there often looked up from their screens sooner, watched the clock more calmly. Some missed their trains and didn't seem upset. A few stayed until the next one came, staring not at the tracks, but at the space just beside them, as though waiting not for departure, but for something to return. And when the sun hit that wall just right, at the edge of evening, when the shadows stretched long and forgiving, a curve could sometimes be seen. Not a stain, not a trick of the light, just the faint shape of something that had once shielded sorrow without needing to dry it. The town never marked the umbrella's presence with a statue or a plaque. There were no tours, no stories written in official histories, no mentions in brochures passed to visitors at the cafe. But those who stayed long enough to walk without direction, to pause without excuse, came to feel it. Not as a tale passed down, but as an atmosphere, a slight shift in how time moved near certain corners, a feeling that some spaces had not been emptied, only held open. In the small local school, a teacher once assigned an essay prompt. Describe something that was never truly yours, but changed you anyway. The answers were varied: a borrowed book, a friend's lullaby, a broken treehouse. But 3 students, without knowing one another's thoughts, described the same thing: an umbrella. One wrote about it appearing in a dream, another about seeing it in a puddle's reflection, and the third simply drew it, closed, dripping, with no hand to hold it. None of them had ever been told the story. The teacher didn't question them. She read the essays, sat with them, and later walked to the station alone. She stood where the old wall met the tile, eyes resting not on the trains, but on the bench beside her. The air felt ordinary. The platform was clean, but something in her posture shifted, as if listening. And then, without quite knowing why, she stepped aside, just slightly, enough to make space. The sky remained clear. No rain fell, but a single leaf tumbled from the roof and landed near her foot, damp as if kissed by something that had passed through. She picked it up, held it for a moment, and then let it go. The wind took it, gently, carefully, toward the corner, and for just a second the glint of moisture on tile shimmered in the light. A line curved downward. A drop. A pause, and then nothing. But by then it was enough. In a room above the town's oldest bookstore, a space not listed on any floor plan, accessible only by a staircase that creaked in a particular pattern, there was a window that had long been painted shut. The room itself was used for storage. Boxes of out-of-print poetry, chairs missing one leg, calendars from decades ago still bearing the scent of ink. Few entered, fewer stayed. But one day, while rearranging the mess left by a shipment that never arrived, the owner noticed a circle of water on the floor. Faint. Perfect. Centered directly beneath the sealed window, which had not been touched in years. The wood around the spot was not warped. There were no signs of a leak, no trails on the glass. Just the darkened ring, no larger than the base of a teacup, and the gentle scent of rain, though the air outside was dry. He touched it, felt its coolness, and for a moment was struck by the strange urge to whisper something. Not a secret, not a prayer, just a thought, suspended, like breath held too long. Rather than clean it, he stepped around it, left it undisturbed. The next day, it had faded, but in its place lay a small thread of gray fabric, barely an inch long, curled as if from the edge of something worn. He picked it up, turned it between his fingers, then slipped it into the spine of a forgotten novel no one had touched in years. The novel had no dust jacket. Its title had faded. But on the first page, written in pencil, were 5 words. This doesn't belong to now. After that, he began keeping a chair near the window. Not directly beneath it, just close enough to face it. He never sat long. Never at the same hour. But each time he brought a different book, opening it to a page at random and reading a single paragraph aloud. Not loudly, not performatively, just enough to let the words enter the room, drift up toward the ceiling, and rest. He never explained this habit to his staff, never mentioned the stain, the thread, or the penciled line. But the room changed. Customers began asking for books about weather, about shelter, about things left behind. A young girl requested a story about something that follows you kindly. A man in his 70s asked if they had anything about waiting, but the kind that feels gentle, not hopeless. The owner found himself recommending titles he didn't remember ordering, pulling them from shelves he thought were empty. And each night, before locking the door, he climbed the creaking stairs one last time, placed a hand on the old frame of the shut window, and stood in silence for exactly 1 minute. Not hoping, not remembering, just keeping company with something that had once stayed wet, even in the sun. There was a musician who lived alone above a bakery that opened before dawn and closed before sunset. He played the cello, not professionally, not publicly, but with the quiet devotion of someone who believed sound could mend what language had worn thin. His neighbors rarely heard him. The walls were thick, the bow gentle. But sometimes, in the blue hours before the streetlights dimmed, a single sustained note would drift down into the street, like a breath that had remembered how to sing. He composed nothing new, preferring instead to play fragments, pieces he couldn't name, or perhaps had invented without realizing. He didn't record them, didn't write them down. He just played, again and again, as though helping something forgotten remember its shape. One rainy morning, as he carried a basket of bread back up to his flat, he found a folded umbrella leaning beside his door. It was not his. It was small, worn, with a wooden handle smooth from many hands. He paused, looked around, but the corridor was empty, the air still. He brought it inside, opened it slowly, not to dry it, but to understand it. The canopy spread with a soft resistance, as if it had not been asked to open in a very long time. Inside there was no marking, no tag, only a faint scent, not of mold, not of dust, but of petrichor, the kind of scent that doesn't belong to fabric, but to memory. He left it open beside the window, though no breeze touched it. That night his playing changed. The notes grew slower, more spacious. He began to pause between movements, letting silence echo longer than before. And in those silences he sometimes imagined he heard something else. A faint rhythm, steady and low, like dripping. Not intrusive, just present. A quiet counterpoint. He did not try to explain it, even to himself. Some things are not meant to be explained, only accompanied. Over the following weeks, visitors began arriving at the bakery below with strange requests. "Do you have that bread that smells like rain?" one asked. "The one that feels like you've already eaten it in a dream?" another said. The baker, who was used to early hours and odd cravings, simply nodded, wrapped a loaf, and handed it over. He didn't ask questions, but he too had noticed that something about the apartment above had changed. The light through the windows lingered longer. The sound of the cello, when it came, felt less like music and more like a place. And the umbrella? It remained by the window, never dry, never wet, just quietly open, as if waiting not for weather, but for harmony. There was an old bridge at the edge of town that no longer crossed anything. The river it once spanned had long since dried to a quiet ditch, filled now with reeds and wind. The bridge remained, wooden planks weathered to silver, rails smooth from decades of resting arms, bolts rusted into place like old promises. People rarely walked it anymore. There were easier ways to get across, but now and then, someone found their way there, not for purpose, but for pause. The bridge had a sound to it, not the creak of age or the whistle of wind, but a rhythm that changed depending on who stood upon it. Some said it echoed footsteps that weren't being taken. Others said it matched heartbeats slowed by memory. No one measured it. No one mapped it. But those who lingered often left quieter than they arrived, their shoulders less rigid, their pace more thoughtful. One autumn evening, after a brief and uneventful drizzle, a man walked out onto the bridge and stopped in the center. He carried nothing, wore no raincoat. His shoes were dusty, untouched by the wet. But where he stood, the planks beneath him were damp, a perfect oval, as though someone had stood there long before him and forgotten to dry the moment. He looked down at the mark and smiled, not surprised, not startled, just affirmed. He stayed until the light changed, until the sky shifted from gray to gold, and the damp spot beneath him faded back into the wood. Then he stepped away, leaving no footprint. But for the rest of that season, a single plank in the center of the bridge held a faint curve. Not carved, not painted, just a difference in texture, like the memory of shelter. People began visiting again, some by accident, some by need. A few left behind small things on the railings, a button, a folded leaf, a photograph with the face turned down. No one disturbed them. The wind scattered what it chose. The rest remained, weathered into place like offerings not to be accepted but simply acknowledged. Children who crossed the bridge began jumping across the center plank, not from fear, but from a sense of ritual, as if they were skipping over something important, even if they didn't know what. Their parents never corrected them. In time, even those who didn't believe in stories began walking the bridge more slowly, hands brushing the rails, eyes softening without reason. And on especially still mornings, when the fog clung low and sound traveled far, the bridge would sometimes sing, a long, low hum, as if wood and silence had agreed on a tune only the patient could hear. In a quiet garden behind the town's long-closed post office, where ivy had long since claimed the fences and birds made nests in the mouth of an old, rusted mailbox, there stood a single metal chair that no one remembered placing. It wasn't elegant, not wrought iron, not antique, just a folding chair, the kind meant for temporary seating at forgotten gatherings. But it never rusted, never moved, and after a light rain, it never dried. The rest of the garden behaved as gardens do, petals closed with dusk, earth soaked and cracked with seasons, the air thick with the perfume of lavender and soil. But the chair remained in a constant state of dampness, not soaked, not dripping, just faintly wet, as though it had recently held someone who never quite left. Gardeners left it alone. Children ignored it without being told. Even cats gave it a curious, respectful distance. Occasionally, someone would try to sit. They would lower themselves halfway, pause, and rise again without touching it fully. Not because they felt unwelcome, but because they felt seen by something silent, unjudging, and not entirely of the present. A town official once proposed removing it, citing aesthetic inconsistency. But the morning he arrived to do so, he found the entire chair covered in fallen petals, not scattered by wind, but placed, densely layered in a perfect circle. He left it. In time, people began placing things beneath the chair. Letters never sent, dried herbs tied with ribbon, pebbles with initials inked faintly on the surface. Nothing extravagant. Just small things, like punctuation at the end of a thought. They were always gone the next morning. Taken, cleared away. No one saw. No one asked. And still the chair remained damp, even in heat waves, even in winter sun, even when everything else cracked and flaked and faded. It held its wetness the way some hearts hold unfinished goodbyes, quietly, permanently, without hope of evaporation. There was a lake outside town, shallow and shaped like a tear that barely appeared on maps. It wasn't large enough for boats or deep enough for fish, but it reflected light in a way that made it seem bottomless. Locals called it the listening water, not because it echoed, but because sound changed around it. Voices dropped to whispers, laughter curled inward, even birdsong softened into something shy. People didn't swim there. They walked the edges, they watched the reeds, and sometimes they threw things into the water, not to skip, not to sink, just to release. A coin, a photo, a key with no door. The ripples were always small, always slow, as if the lake was absorbing not just the object but its meaning. One morning, near the far side where the grass grew taller and the ground stayed soft long into summer, someone found an umbrella, open, upright, half sunk into the shallows as though planted like a flower. Its fabric rippled in the breeze, though the water around it didn't move. A few dragonflies rested on its edges. No one approached. They only stood at a distance, shoes sinking slightly into the mud, and watched. It remained for 3 days. Then, without announcement or sighting, it was gone. No marks, no prints, only a faint depression in the grass and a damp scent that lingered for hours, like rain remembered from a dream. After that, the lake began reflecting things differently. People swore they saw shapes not their own, shadows of umbrellas, outlines of people not standing nearby. One child said the water held things waiting to dry. No one corrected him. And though the town never built a path to the lake or put up signs, more people began walking there, not to change anything, not to learn, just to be near the surface of something that listened back. And so the umbrella, whether gone or dispersed or transformed, continued to shape the spaces it had once touched, not as an object, but as a gesture, a curve in memory, a softness in place, something between absence and presence that never demanded to be resolved. The town, for all its renovations and erasures, carried that impression the way old paper carries the ghost of erased words. Faint, but unforgotten. The wall at the station remained unadorned. The bench beside it occasionally creaked without weight, and now and then, especially at dusk, someone would pass through and pause, not to look, not even to feel, but to recognize. A stillness that met them. A patience that did not ask for understanding, only acknowledgement. In time, new people moved in. Children grew up not knowing the full story, only fragments, of chairs that stayed wet, of windows that sang when opened, of lakes that kept secrets. They added their own meanings, their own silences. The umbrella didn't need to return. It had never really left. It had become a way the town exhaled, slowly, gently, into the corners of rooms and the folds of habits. And those who listened closely, in attics, on benches, beside puddles that didn't reflect the sky, heard something more than dripping. They heard waiting. They heard grace. And sometimes, when the sun shone hard and no rain had touched the ground for weeks, someone would still feel a drop land softly on their shoulder, and they would smile, because they understood. It wasn't the weather. It was remembrance.